What's on your radar, Batya?
Over the past 15 years, the motley coalition that makes up the Democratic Party has undergone what one researcher is calling a dramatic demographic change in a new paper published by the Manhattan Institute. Political scientist Zach Goldberg, the academic who first uncovered the Great Awakening, has found a new and growing class divide not just between the Democrats and the Republicans, but within the Democratic Party itself. And it's a divide that maps onto race. Though the white share of the Democratic Party has declined significantly, the attrition has been mostly from whites without a college degree. The white Americans who remain Democrats are increasingly likely to be college educated, while non-white Democrats remain mostly non-college educated. This new class divide within the Democratic coalition marries white elites with working class people of color, quote, exacerbating socioeconomic inequalities within the coalition, as Goldberg put it. Quote, those with a college education tend to be wealthier and have higher socioeconomic status than those without, but they also tend to be more socially liberal and more likely to prioritize post-material moral concerns over kitchen table issues, writes Goldberg. And because education and wealth correlate with political power, the Democratic Party will likely become a majority-minority party relatively soon, but one that is still largely and disproportionately steered by liberal, college-educated whites, writes Goldberg. We've already seen where the over-credentialed elite has navigated what was once the party of labor, radically astray from the priorities of the working class. Consider the defund the police movement, so popular among the denizens of gated communities and liberal enclaves with private security, yet so unpopular with Black Americans, less than 20% of whom supported the movement. Or consider the kind of people who list climate change as a major threat and extremely important issue, for which there exists a 30-point gap separating Democrats overall from Black Democrats specifically. Or consider last month's finding from the Pew Research Center. Pew found a huge difference between white and Black Democrats on the question of transgender identity. When it comes to gender, fully 72% of white Democrats believe that whether a person is a man or a woman is a matter of subjective identity, compared to just 33% of Black Democrats. 66% of Black Democrats, like 60% of Americans overall, believe that whether a person is a man or a woman is decided by the sex he or she is assigned at birth. In other words, 2/3 of Black Americans totally reject the very concept of transgenderism. Perhaps even more surprising is that this number has risen significantly by 11% since 2017, Pew found. When it comes to issues of gender and identity, Black Americans, like Americans more generally, are getting more conservative, although not importantly on questions like gay marriage, for which everybody is getting more and more accepting. Of course, you wouldn't know this from the kinds of proposals you hear from the party that purports to represent Black voters. And if you want to know why, consider that in addition to the racial divide separating Black and white Democrats over the trans issue, there is also a class divide. Pew found that among college-educated Democrats, 72% said, quote, a greater acceptance of transgender people is good for society, compared to just 45% with a high school diploma or less. This divide is the only endgame in a party in which a racial divide is mapped onto a class divide. But it's not just on cultural issues or questions of identity. You can see the two-tiered nature of the new Democratic Party in the way the party has flipped its position on immigration. Once the Democrats viewed limiting immigration as a huge priority because it was seen, correctly, as crucial to protecting working-class jobs and wages. As recently as 2015, Bernie Sanders was scoffing at the suggestion of open borders as a, quote, Koch brothers proposal, though by 2020 he was committing to decriminalizing illegal border crossing. But even by 2015, Sanders' position was a nostalgic throwback to a time when the Democratic Party was truly the party of labor. National unions themselves underwent this change on immigration, reflective of a larger shift towards a college-educated leadership that has been alienating rank-and-file members, presaging the development in the Democratic Party more broadly. Meanwhile, Black Americans remain deeply skeptical about unfettered immigration. Black Americans are more supportive of limiting immigration than any other bloc of the Democratic coalition, the sociologist Musa Al-Gharbi reported. And Hispanics actually tend to be more concerned about illegal immigration than are whites or Blacks. The support Black and Hispanic Americans have for securing the border puts the lie to the slander that it's white supremacy that makes Americans worried about mass immigration, a slander that white over-credentialed Democrats created to smear Republicans, safe from the pinch of competition from laborers without an education from other countries. Meanwhile, they sentenced their own voters to pay the price for their vanity morals. Expect much more of this. In his State of the Union address, President Biden made an impassioned plea to blue-collar voters that Democrats are still the party of labor. With an emphasis on reshoring manufacturing and fighting fentanyl, he sounded a lot like President Trump. Yet skeptics heard only hot air, and you can understand why the next day, when James Carville, the famous Democratic consultant and strategist, called the Republicans white trash for their vocal opposition to the president. Take a look at this.
Well, I told people I have a PhD in white trashology, and you saw real white trash on display. And let me say something about Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene. She dresses like white trash. She really needs a fashion consultant. Could I recommend George Santos? He could do a good job of dressing up where she doesn't announce her white trashdom by her own clothes.
Well, I'll tell you, James.
This sounds like it's about a political divide, but it's not. It's about the disgust that credentialed elites have for the working class. And make no mistake about it, it's coming home to roost in their own party. Zach Goldberg, the academic who first uncovered the Great Awakening and wrote this great paper from the Manhattan Institute, now joins us to weigh in. Zach, welcome to Rising. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So your work was so crucial to my book. I could not have written my book without your amazing, amazing work. Tell us about what made you first do the research that uncovered the Great Awakening. And then I also want you to talk a little bit about the role that the media has played, because your work focuses on that and it's extremely important.
Yeah. And that actually will, I guess, bring us to how I studied this topic about educational polarization and how that's remaking the two parties. Essentially, my, I guess, interest or my foray into the Great Awakening occurred as a result of wanting to understand Trump voters, just like all other political scientists in the wake of the 2016 election. Was probably one of the more unconventional presidential candidates in history, and we could save all the isms, but everybody was really wondering, what is really driving all these people to vote for Trump? And I was looking to compare, the attitudes of Trump voters with Romney voters, and past voters of Republican presidents. And when I actually looked at the data, especially, attitudes towards Muslims, attitudes towards just everything. And when I looked at and I compared attitudes across these different GOP voters, I noticed that, there's not that big of a difference between a Trump voter in 2016 and a Romney voter in 2012. In some ways, they're actually a little bit more moderate on some issues, on economic issues. Anyways, I was expecting to see a massive gulf between the racism of the 2016 Trump voters and the Romney voters, and I didn't really see much. But what I did see was an unprecedented growth in the liberal direction among, Democratic voters, between Hillary voters in 2016 and the Obama voters of 2012. And I wanted to see, okay, this is pretty unprecedented. When do these changes really begin? And this is kind of what brought me to really look at hundreds and hundreds of different, measures of attitudes across time to really trace when this big shift in Democratic public opinion, or white liberal public opinion especially, had occurred. And from what I could see in the data, especially on race, that it occurred around 2013, 2014, which incidentally is the marks or coincides with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of social media, and a rise of a lot of trends, including trends in mental health, which maybe we won't have time to talk about today, but is definitely it's overlapping with that the Great Awakening.
It's funny though, because we're assured all the time by the media. I'll hear claims that the Democratic Party has stayed right where it is ideologically, and the Republican Party just keeps moving further and further and further right. And you're saying your research shows the opposite.
Yeah, and it's not just my research. If you look at most issues, you'll find maybe an issue or two where the Republicans, Republican base, has moved to the right. But by and large, let's say in 85 to 90% of all issues, especially social issues, it's been the Democrats lurching to the left. And even Republican voters have also kind of moved in a liberal direction, just not as quickly as those on the left. So it kind of looks like if you were to just ignore the movement of those to the left, it looks like those on the right are really very regressive in a lot of these issues. It just they haven't moved as quickly at the same clip as those on the left. So that's why it appears like I said, you could find some issues maybe that they've moved to the right, but by and large, on immigration especially, which they're tied to being more radical, or really they haven't moved in decades. They've had the same position. It just happens that you have politicians like Trump that are kind of playing to this already pre-existing sentiment that's always existed. It hasn't really changed much among rank and file, conservatives. But now you have.
So Zach, talk us through how the media has played a role in creating the misapprehension that Robbie just pointed out. Like, what is the role the media has played both in fomenting the Great Awakening and also in trying to convince us that it's Republicans who have become more extreme when it's actually the left that has?
Well, yeah. My dissertation work has looked at the trends in the frequency at which the media is covering certain topics, such as racism, such as white supremacy, such as privilege, all the buzzwords. These are terms that really were only very sparingly used back, let's say, as recently even as like 20 years ago. And in around 2000, like I said, around 2012, during that period, let's say the early years of the second Obama term, you see this massive spike in interest in the amount of in the frequency that the media is using terms like racist. And I think a part of that, and I don't mention this explicitly in my dissertation, but I think a part of that is the Tea Party, the rise of the Tea Party, was construed in a lot of liberal circles as being, racially motivated. And maybe there is such racial motivations maybe were present. They were an element among the wider Tea Party, but the Tea Party is a very large, diverse group, and I think that there was, a desire to kind of reduce it all to just racism. All opposition to Obama and I think that's why you saw those initial rises in interest in racism and white supremacy in 2012 or so, and then after that you had the Black Lives Matter, in 2013, the Trayvon Martin, that case, and you start to see not only a change in the media mentions of racist, but also change in the framing of certain topics, like systemic racism, institutional racism. These are academic terms that have been around since the 1970s. And we really, they've been very rarely used, seldom used in the media. But during this period, you start to see a very rapid rise, a steady rise in the extent that these issues are being viewed or, in terms of systemic racism, for instance. That's not something, a frame that the media has used very much until recently.
Well, Zach, we're going to have to leave it at that. We're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us and for your incredibly important work. Keep it up. Take heart. I mean, it's just, I cannot stress this enough. Your work is so crucial. Thank you so much for doing it and for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. Hope to be back.
There'll be more Rising right after this. Stay with us.